Moving on to other news now, the Center for Competition, Regulation and Economic Development at the University of Johannesburg has released a report into barriers of entry into different businesses. The obstacles to rival entrants, according to the research, are a combination of intrinsic features of the markets, consumer behavior, strategic exclusionary conduct by incumbents, as well as risk aversion in financing entrants. Well, the report says South African economy needs new approach to regulation, competition and industrial policy to open the economy for greater participation, particularly by black industrialists, I beg your pardon. Now, joining us to talk about the barriers faced when entering businesses in the country, we are joined in the studio by Thando Vilakazi, who is Senior Researcher at the CCRED. Thank you very much for joining us. Welcome.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
When you're talking about barriers of entry into business, you're talking about basically difficulties of people who want to get into business but cannot because of the obstacles thereof.
Yeah.
Well, what's causing that difficulty?
Sure. Thanks, Colin. I think there's a range of factors, and there's been lots of research over time in South Africa that's looked at the challenges that new companies face. Our specific research is sort of say, well, even where firms access funding, for instance, there's still particular challenges that they experience in terms of getting in and really establishing themselves in different sectors of the economy. And this has a lot to do with characteristics of the economy in many ways. For instance, we know that us as consumers tend to be quite stuck in our ways. So there's a problem of consumer inertia in terms of people willing to switch to new products and brands. There's issues around whether new firms are able to gain scale. So it's one thing to get your foot into the door, but can you get your operations to be large enough and efficient enough to actually start lowering your costs and delivering benefits to consumers? Because we all know when you first enter a sector as a new business, you don't start making money off the go. There's still some challenges to be overcome. And a range of other issues. Even where firms can access funding, it's often on commercial terms, and so it's particularly difficult for firms to get access to commercial loans, etc., particularly to help them through those very difficult times in the early stages of business.
Is it a problem of these smaller companies not being well capitalized when they want to launch their product? When you're talking about manufacturing and you're talking about consumer behavior, it's going to be difficult for somebody who is operating from a backyard or just an industrial area where he's just rented an operating space, and then he wants to launch a product like a new tissue in the market, or for example, you want to launch new furniture in the market and be a supplier, or even those who want to launch dishwashers, for example. For somebody who lives in a township, they would like to use famous brands, and then how is a new brand supposed to be introduced into the market when there is probably not even a budget for advertising?
Yeah. I think, Colin, that's exactly at the heart of the issue we're trying to assess, right? And that we've sought to assess through this research. It's saying, what are the stages that a firm goes through to reach the market? So, for instance, one of the big problems that the research identifies is that often, for instance, take an example of agro-processing. You have a number of new black growers of chicken products, right? Day-old chicken products, etc. But a big problem with that sector, and you can think about milling where you're producing bread and flour products, etc. as well, is that you still have to get the products to the shelf, right? Which means it involves your supermarket groups in being able to take in those products, and often that's where the barrier is. So some of the people with interviews will tell you that, the funding was great and it was great to have state support, but the thing that really made a difference in my business as a young farmer or as a new producer of, say, wheat flour, for instance, was the ability to access the shelves in the supermarkets. And that's some of the areas where we propose certain solutions, in fact. Yeah,
there are frustrations in that area when you're talking about farming, because I'm from the Northwest and I know of a farmer who is producing vegetables, but he's not able to sell in the mainstream market because he's excluded. And there are barriers in terms of the conditions and the prices that he's supposed to supply his products on. And if he's doesn't agree, it's a take it or leave it kind of a scenario. What does your research say about that kind of frustration?
Sure. So what our research says, and I think that's a great question, what our research says is that there are certain things we can do even within our current policy frameworks within the state that can change that scenario for that farmer, for instance, or that could have changed the scenario for Capitec, for instance. So for instance, you take that example which we looked at, and it took them a number of years to actually gain traction in the South African market. It's particularly difficult. And if you think the challenges are big for a well-funded large company like that, you can only imagine then the challenges that certain small farmers, for instance, and producers experience. And the issue is, how do we use the current regulatory frameworks to allow for entry? So for instance, are there certain partnerships that we could arrive at, for instance, with supermarket groups, where they guarantee offtake from small producers in different locations around the country? And this could be partnerships. So we're not saying more regulation. We're not necessarily saying a complete turnaround in certain policies. What we're saying is let's use what we've got in the particular frameworks to support the entrants that we have. Otherwise, you run the risk of having an economy in 5-10 years' time.
But let's ask a blunt question. You know, a blunt question for me would say, if there is a small business owner out there who has developed and produced products and cannot sell them in the market, the question is, who is refusing? And what is his capacity? What is his position in that cartel that is blocking and discriminating against those people who are BEE compliant?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think one of the key areas there, and you're touching on the issue of, for instance, cartels, is that often you have firms that are on the inside. So the insiders, the big boys that are already in the market, doing certain things in the market, as you're alluding to keep out entrants. So not buying from them or doing certain things in the market to prevent them from accessing shelves or from accessing production facilities. And one way to answer that really is that the Competition Act, of course, deals with some of these issues, right? It's designed to provide a mechanism for small firms in particular, as the wording of the Act goes, to be able to complain against certain abuses of dominance, for instance, that occur, or certain conduct by cartels. But often, if you're a small firm, the current framing of that Act doesn't allow you to win those cases. And that's one of the areas in which we're proposing solutions, in fact. We're saying, let's amend the Competition Act in certain respects to make it possible for you and I, if I'm a small farmer, to go and complain against the large giants and say they're excluding me from accessing the market in certain ways. And that's some of the solutions that we propose.
Okay, so I'm sensing sabotage from there.
You might call it sabotage, but I think in many cases it's just the kind of laziness that comes with incumbency. Okay. When you're a large dominant firm, you're less inclined to innovate or to kind of allow anyone into your space, I guess.
All right, Thando Vilakazi, thank you very much for talking to us. A very interesting subject there on barriers of access to the markets.